The Galactic Council had existed for over 4,000 years. It was old. It was proud. And it had never, not once in all its long history, been told no by a species that still used chemical rockets when it first reached the stars. But humans were different. Everyone in the galaxy knew that. The problem was, the Council had forgotten what that difference actually meant. The Terran Empire was not the largest power in the galaxy. It did not have the most planets, the most ships, or the most ancient bloodlines. What it had was something far harder to measure, a particular kind of stubbornness that lived deep in human bones, passed down from a species that had crawled out of ice ages, survived plagues, rebuilt after wars, and looked at extinction in the face more times than any other civilization in recorded galactic history. Humans did not break. They bent, sometimes, but they always came back harder. For 3 decades, the Terran Empire had been a member of the Galactic Council. They had sent diplomats, paid their dues, followed most of the rules, and kept their military quietly behind their own borders. The other species had found this amusing at first. Humans were young. Humans were emotional. Humans needed guidance, or so the elder races believed. Ambassador Sarah Voss had been representing Terra for 11 years in the council chambers on Vareth Prime. She was a tall woman with sharp gray eyes and a calm that most species mistook for weakness. She had sat through thousands of sessions, voted on hundreds of resolutions, and smiled through diplomatic insults that would have started wars between other species. She was patient. She was professional. And she had been sending the same warning home to the Terran Senate for 6 years. The Council is moving against us. Slowly. Quietly. But they are moving. Nobody believed her at first. The Council was a stabilizing force, they said. The Council had rules. The Council had kept galactic peace for millennia. But Sarah had watched the small things. The shipping lane realignments that always seemed to push Terran trade routes an extra 3 jumps longer than necessary. The technology sharing agreements that somehow always excluded human applicants. The border mediation cases where Terran colony claims were consistently ruled against, even when the evidence was clear. Alone, each thing looked like coincidence. Together, they painted a picture. The Vareth, who held the Council's rotating chair that decade, had grown tired of human independence. Elder Counselor Dravith, a being of considerable age and considerable arrogance, had made his position known in private sessions that Sarah had not been invited to, but had learned about anyway. Humans, he believed, needed to be managed. They were too unpredictable, too aggressive in their expansion, too willing to ignore council recommendations when those recommendations did not suit them. They needed to be brought to heel, as he had privately put it, before they became a genuine problem. The plan had been elegant, in the cold way that ancient bureaucracies could be elegant. The Council would not attack Terra. They would simply make the Terran Empire smaller, slower, and weaker through 1,000 carefully placed administrative decisions, until the humans had no choice but to accept a lesser role in galactic affairs. It was the kind of war that left no blood on the floor, the kind that took generations to notice. Sarah noticed. She filed her reports. She documented everything. And then, 6 months ago, the Council had done something they could not take back. They had approved the Outer Reach Redistribution Act, a resolution that, buried in 400 pages of trade and settlement law, quietly stripped 6 Terran colony worlds of their protected status and opened them to claim by any member species with sufficient presence in the region. 3 of those worlds had been settled by humans for over 80 years. One of them, Caldwell's Rest, had a population of 9 million people. The Terran Senate had gone very quiet when they read the resolution. That was the moment Sarah had feared most. Not anger, but quiet. Humans were loudest when they were harmless and quietest when they were serious. Back on Terra, in the capital city of New Geneva, the Senate chambers were full for the first time in a decade. Every seat occupied. No one was late. Prime Director Halen Morrow stood at the center podium with the same stillness that Sarah had perfected over years of diplomacy, and he read the resolution aloud in its entirety. All 412 pages. It took most of the day. He did not raise his voice once. When he finished, he looked up at the assembled senators and spoke 11 words. I would like to know what the Council expects to happen. No one laughed. No one made speeches about restraint or proportionality. The Defense Committee met that same night. Admiral Yara Okafor, commander of the Terran Imperial Fleet, was called in from a classified exercises program 3 systems away. She arrived in 12 hours, which told the Senate everything they needed to know about how prepared the military already was. Okafor was a small woman who moved like a person who had never once in her life been unsure of what she was doing. She had commanded the fleet through the Catherine incident, the Rim blockade, and the silent crisis at Bastion Station that the public still didn't know about. She laid her briefing materials on the table, looked at the committee, and said simply, "Tell me what you want, and I'll tell you what it costs." What followed was not a declaration of war. Not yet. What followed was a message, carefully worded, formally delivered through the proper diplomatic channels, and absolutely crystal clear in its meaning. The Terran Empire did not recognize the Outer Reach Redistribution Act. The 6 colony worlds remained Terran territory. Any attempt by any species to establish a presence on those worlds would be considered an act of aggression and treated accordingly. Ambassador Sarah Voss delivered the message personally to Elder Counselor Dravith in the council chambers on Vareth Prime. She placed the physical document on his desk, which was considered deeply informal by Vareth standards, and waited while his translation implant processed it. She watched his expression shift through confusion, then irritation, then something that looked very much like dismissal. "This is not how the process works," he said. "No," Sarah agreed. "It is not." She left before he could respond. Across the galaxy, in the embassies and monitoring stations and intelligence offices of every council member species, analysts began paying much closer attention to Terran space. The humans had said no before, quietly, in small ways. But this was different. This was a formal, public, documented refusal delivered directly to the council chair. The Yalari, who had studied humans longer than any other species, immediately flagged the situation as critical and requested emergency briefings. Their lead xenopolitical analyst, a cautious being named Kaith, pulled up every historical record of human behavior in conflict situations and ran probability models until the numbers scared her enough to request a second opinion. The second opinion scared her more. Most species in the galaxy argued until they were exhausted and then negotiated. Humans, the historical data suggested, argued until they were pushed, and then they stopped arguing entirely. The council had been pushing for 6 years. On Caldwell's Rest, a colony administrator named Yusuf Brennan received a quiet communication from the Terran Defense Ministry. It was not a warning to evacuate. It was not a request for information. It was a simple, brief message informing him that 3 Terran Imperial warships had been repositioned to the outer edge of his system and would be conducting extended patrol operations. Standard procedure, the message said. Yusuf had grown up on Caldwell's Rest. His grandmother had helped build the first settlement. He had never once in his life thought about leaving. He read the message twice, then looked out his office window at the red-orange plains that stretched to the horizon under a sky that still sometimes made him catch his breath. He sent one reply, just 2 words. "Thank you." The council, meanwhile, had begun drafting their response to the Terran refusal. Dravith had convened a closed session. The mood was irritated but not alarmed. They had handled difficult species before. Humans would make noise for a while, and then they would come to the table like everyone else always did. Not one of them asked the one question that mattered. Not one of them looked at the history of humanity, at the ice ages and the plagues and the wars and the rebuildings, and asked what happened to the things that got in the way. They were about to find out. The council's formal response arrived at the Terran embassy on Vareth Prime exactly 9 days after Sarah Voss had placed the refusal document on Dravith's desk. It was long. It cited precedent going back 2,000 years. It used the kind of language that had been designed over centuries to sound reasonable while meaning absolutely nothing. At its core, it said 2 things. The Redistribution Act was legal, and Terra was expected to comply. Sarah read it once, forwarded it to New Geneva, and poured herself a cup of coffee. Back home, the Senate had already moved on from debate. The question was no longer whether to respond. The question was how, and how much, and in what order. Prime Director Morrow had assembled a small group, 6 senators, Admiral Okafor, the head of Terran intelligence, and 2 people whose names were not included in any official record, and they had been meeting every morning for a week in a room with no network access and no recording devices. What came out of those meetings was a plan that was elegant in the way that human plans were elegant, not through complexity, but through a kind of ruthless simplicity that other species consistently underestimated. The Terran Empire would not argue further. They would not counterpropose. They would not ask for mediation, appeal to council subcommittees, or request independent review. All of those options took time, and time, the small group had decided, was exactly what the council wanted. Every month of deliberation was another month of slow economic pressure, another month of shipping lane disadvantages, another month of Terran colonies sitting in legally ambiguous territory while other species quietly moved assets into position. Instead, the Terran Empire would act. It began with economics, because humans had learned long ago that you never start with the loudest option when a quieter one will do the same work. The Terran government announced a comprehensive review of all trade agreements with council member species. Pending review, shipments of 17 categories of goods, including 3 that were deeply unpleasant to lose access to suddenly, were placed on temporary hold. The review was expected to take 8 to 14 months. The Yulari lost access to Terran medical synthesizer components. Their health ministry sent a frantic communique to the council within 48 hours. The Preth Collective, which had built much of its industrial expansion over the past decade on Terran-designed atmospheric processors, found their parts supply abruptly uncertain. Even the Verith, who prided themselves on self-sufficiency, quietly discovered that 2 of their deep space monitoring networks ran on Terran software that required regular licensing updates. The council chambers on Verith Prime became considerably louder. Dravith convened an emergency session. 14 species showed up in person, which was unusual. 3 more attended via quantum link, which was even more unusual. Everyone had something to say, but none of it was particularly coherent, because none of them had expected this. Humans were supposed to argue back through diplomatic channels. Humans were supposed to be frustrated and loud and ultimately compliant, the way young species always were eventually. This was not frustration. This was organized. The Yulari analyst Kaith watched the session from her monitoring post and updated her probability models. The numbers got worse. She flagged the update as urgent and sent it directly to her government's executive council, bypassing the normal reporting chain. Her note was short. They are not reacting. They are executing. While the council argued, Admiral Okafor moved her ships. It was done quietly, in the way that large militaries can move quietly when they have decided that quiet is no longer the same as slow. 12 vessels from the Second Fleet repositioned to staging points near the 3 most contested colony systems. They did not cross any borders. They did not power weapons. They ran standard patrol configurations and filed all the correct navigation notices with the relevant authorities. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. But they were there. The colony on Caldwell's Rest watched 3 Terran Imperial warships settle into a slow orbit of their outer system and felt something they hadn't felt in months, like the floor was solid again. Administrator Yusuf Brennan organized a public address, which was unusual for him because he was not a man who liked public addresses. He stood in the central square of the main settlement, under the red-orange sky that still sometimes made people stop and stare, and he said 3 sentences. The Empire knows we're here. The Empire is watching. Go about your lives. People went back to work. Children went to school. The farmers in the Eastern Plains who had been quietly looking up prices for property in safer systems stopped looking. Back on Verith Prime, a Serati diplomat named Vel approached Sarah Voss at a reception neither of them particularly wanted to attend. The Serati were one of the elder races, older even than the Verith, and they had a reputation for saying things that were true in ways that made everyone else uncomfortable. Vel waited until they were away from the main group, standing near a window that looked out over the vast, illuminated cityscape of the council's capital. Your people are not what we thought, Vel said. No, Sarah agreed. We usually aren't. We voted for the act, Vel said. I want you to know that it was not personal. It was political. There is a difference. I know, Sarah said. We remember political decisions very well. We'll remember this one. Vel looked at her for a long moment. How far does your government intend to go? Sarah turned to look at the city lights. That depends entirely on the council. The Serati diplomat was quiet for a while. Then, I am going to recommend to my government that we abstain from any further action against Terran interests. That's a wise recommendation, Sarah said. She did not smile. Neither did Vel. Meanwhile, in the intelligence community, things were moving faster than the public knew. Terran intelligence had spent years quietly mapping the informal power structures inside the council. Not the official voting records, but the actual relationships. Who owed whom? Who feared whom? Which council members were genuinely committed to the Redistribution Act, and which had simply voted yes because they thought it would cost them nothing. The answer was that most of them had voted yes because they thought it would cost them nothing. That calculation was changing rapidly. 6 council member species reached out through back channels within the first 2 weeks of the trade review. None of them used official communication protocols. All of them wanted to discuss the situation informally, off the record, without any of it appearing in official logs. Terran intelligence forwarded all 6 contacts to Prime Director Morrow's office. He read them and wrote one sentence in response for all 6. We are happy to talk once the act is rescinded. Dravith, receiving reports of these contacts from his own intelligence services, became genuinely angry for the first time. He had expected humans to negotiate from weakness. He had built the entire strategy around the assumption that a young species, facing the unified weight of the council, would eventually look for a way to accept less than they wanted while saving some face. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. But the humans were not negotiating from weakness. They were applying pressure from every direction simultaneously, economic, military, diplomatic, and doing it with a calmness that was somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been. An angry species could be managed. An angry species made mistakes, escalated at the wrong moment, gave you things to point at. A calm species executing a plan was something else entirely. He called in his senior advisors and asked them a question he had not thought to ask before. What do humans do when they have decided that talking is finished? There was a long silence in the room. One of his advisors, who had studied xenohistory as a secondary discipline, spoke carefully. They build things, she said. Large things. And then they use them. Dravith looked at her. What kinds of things? She pulled up a historical file. The list was long. She did not read all of it. She read enough. The room was very quiet after that. On the border of Terran space, 3 systems away from Caldwell's Rest, a Preth survey vessel detected an unusual energy signature near an uninhabited moon. They reported it to their government, who reported it to the council, who asked their technical analysts to review the data. The analysts took 2 days, then returned their assessment. It was the power output of a construction operation. Something was being built. Something large. The analysts could not determine from the signature exactly what it was, but they could tell it was military in nature, it was moving quickly, and it was not in any registered construction schedule that the Terran Empire had filed with the Council. Which meant either the Terran Empire had forgotten to file the paperwork, or the Terran Empire no longer cared about filing the paperwork. Dravith received the report at the same time he received a personal communication from the Terran Prime Director's office. It was not a diplomatic note. It was not a counterproposal. It was a calendar invitation, formal, polite, and final in the way that only ultimatums disguised as invitations can be. Prime Director Morrow was requesting a direct session with the full council, in person, on Vareth Prime, in 30 days. The invitation did not say what would happen in 30 days if the session did not occur. It didn't need to. Prime Director Halen Morrow arrived on Vareth Prime with no fanfare and no large delegation. He brought 12 people, 4 advisors, 2 security personnel, Ambassador Sarah Voss, Admiral Okafor, and 3 individuals whose roles were listed simply as consultants. He did not arrive in the ceremonial state vessel that council protocol specified for heads of government. He arrived in a standard diplomatic transport, fast and undecorated, and he landed at a secondary terminal rather than the main state port. Every single decision about his arrival had been deliberate. The message was not subtle. The Terran Prime Director had not come to be received. He had come to speak. Council protocol required that visiting heads of state be given a formal welcome ceremony before any official session. Morrow's office had sent a politely worded note 2 days before arrival confirming that the ceremony would not be necessary. The council's administrative staff had not known what to do with this, and had escalated at 3 levels before someone made a decision. The ceremony was cancelled. Dravith had read the note about it and said nothing, which his staff had learned meant he was more disturbed than if he had said something loud. The full council session was scheduled for the following morning. 31 species represented, most of them in person, the rest via quantum link. It was the largest single gathering of member governments in 11 years. Sarah Voss walked through the preparation briefings that night and noted, with a quiet satisfaction she kept entirely off her face, that the room was clearly nervous. That was new. Galactic Council sessions were not nervous events. They were long, procedural, often boring, and conducted with the confidence of institutions that had existed long enough to believe they were permanent. This one felt different. The staff moved with a slightly different energy. The translators double-checked their setups more than usual. Even the refreshment arrangements had been handled with unusual care, as if someone had decided that small comforts might matter. Morrow slept well. Sarah found this either impressive or faintly inhuman, depending on the hour. The session began exactly on schedule, which was itself unusual. Dravith opened with the standard procedural elements, his voice carrying the particular smoothness of someone who had been doing this for centuries. He was good at it. Whatever his failures of judgment in the past months, he was genuinely skilled at the mechanics of formal power. He welcomed the Prime Director, acknowledged the significance of his visit, and invited him to address the council. Morrow stood up. He was not a physically imposing man. Medium height, gray at the temples, the kind of face that forgot you immediately if you weren't paying attention. He had been chosen by the Terran Senate partly for this quality, the ability to stand in a room and seem like the least dangerous person in it right up until he was not. He spoke for 40 minutes without notes. He did not raise his voice. He did not use dramatic language. He laid out, in simple and precise terms, a complete accounting of everything the Council had done to Terran interests over the past 6 years. The shipping lane decisions, the technology agreements, the border claims, the Redistribution Act. He cited document numbers. He cited dates. He cited the names of the Council members who had voted on each item. He had it all, and he said all of it in the same, even tone that a person might use to describe the weather. 3/4 of the way through, he paused. He looked around the room. He said, "I want to be clear about one thing. We understand why you did this. We are not going to pretend we don't. The Council has been trying to limit Terran growth and influence through administrative pressure because a direct confrontation seemed too costly. That is a rational calculation. I respect rational calculations." He paused again. It was, however, the wrong one. He then spent the remaining 10 minutes not on diplomacy, but on facts. The Terran Empire's current military readiness. Fleet positioning. The construction project near Caldwell's Rest, which he identified without any particular emphasis as a forward logistics and repair station capable of supporting extended operations in the outer reach. He explained, in the same quiet voice, that the Terran Empire had no interest in war, had never had an interest in war with the Council, and was not interested in one now. But, if the Redistribution Act was not rescinded within 60 days, the Terran Empire would begin treating any Council member species with assets in the 6 contested systems as having accepted a state of territorial dispute. Disputes of that kind, under Terran imperial law, entitled the Empire to take protective measures up to and including the physical removal of foreign assets from Terran-claimed space. He sat down. The room was quiet for a long time. The first to speak was not Dravith. It was the Yulari representative, a senior counselor named Hoth, who had the look of someone who had already done the math and found the answer unpleasant. "You are describing military action," Hoth said. "I am describing protective measures under imperial law," Morrow said. "What they look like on the ground will depend on what we find on the ground." "This is unprecedented," said a Preth delegate. "Yes," said Morrow. "Most things humans do are unprecedented the first time." There was another silence. Sarah, watching from her seat, saw something pass through the room. Not just nervousness now, but a kind of recalibration. The Council members were looking at each other in the way that beings look at each other when they are trying to determine, without saying it out loud, whether anyone else is going to hold the line or whether they are all about to discover that the line was not where they thought it was. Dravith spoke. His voice was controlled, but something had changed behind his eyes. The council does not respond to threats. I know, Morrow said. I am not making a threat. I am making a statement of intent. There is a difference. A threat is conditional on your behavior. A statement of intent is simply what we are going to do. Kaith, the Yulari analyst, was watching the session from her monitoring post. She had been running probability models for weeks. She updated them now, in real time, as Morrow spoke. The numbers had been bad before. They were worse now, not because of anything aggressive Morrow had said, but because of how he had said it. The absence of anger. The complete absence of any signal that he wanted to negotiate the core issue. She had studied enough human history to know what that meant. She sent a new message to the Yulari Executive Council. It was the shortest report she had ever written. It said, "They have already decided. This session is courtesy." Back in the chamber, the council had moved into procedural discussion, which was what councils did when they needed time to think without appearing to need time to think. Morrow sat quietly through it. His advisors sat quietly with him. None of them checked communications. None of them conferred in whispers. They simply waited, with the particular patience of people who were not worried about time. During the recess, 3 separate delegations approached Sarah Voss privately. The Serati, who had already signaled their withdrawal from the situation. A smaller species called the Renati, who had voted for the act because they had been told to and were now clearly reconsidering the cost of that decision. And a Varith junior counselor who had been sent by someone more senior than himself to ask, very carefully and unofficially, whether there was any room for a face-saving compromise. Sarah told all 3 the same thing Morrow had told the back-channel contacts weeks earlier. The act needs to go. After that, we can talk about anything. The junior Varith counselor went back to his principals with this answer, and a look on his face that suggested he was not looking forward to delivering it. That evening, Morrow and Admiral Okafor had dinner alone in the Terran embassy. The meal was simple. They had both learned long ago not to trust food they didn't know on planets they didn't control. They talked about the session, briefly. Then they talked about the fleet, briefly. Then they were quiet for a while. The comfortable silence of 2 people who had known each other long enough to not need to fill it. Finally, Okafor said, "They're going to try to run out the clock." Morrow nodded. "Some of them. What do you want me to do when the 60 days are up and nothing has changed?" Morrow looked at his coffee. He thought about Caldwell's rest, about 9 million people under a red-orange sky, about a colony administrator who had sent 2 words back to the Defense Ministry and gone about his life. He thought about the 6 years of slow pressure, the 1,000 administrative decisions, the accumulated weight of being managed by people who thought managing was the same as governing. "Be ready," he said. "Be very ready." Outside the embassy windows, Varith Prime's capital city hummed with its ancient lights. Somewhere across the galaxy, 3 Terran warships circled a contested system in slow, patient orbits. And in the construction yard near the uninhabited moon, work continued through the night, around the clock, at a pace that the Terran engineers had not publicly announced and the Council's analysts were only beginning to understand. The 60-day clock was running. And across 31 council chambers, in 31 different systems, 31 different governments were having 31 different versions of the same conversation, wondering, for the first time seriously, whether the plan had ever been as solid as it had looked. Not all of them arrived at the same answer, but enough of them did that the room, when they reassembled the next morning, was subtly different, less certain, more careful. Dravith noticed. He was too experienced not to. He sat in the chair and ran the session with his usual smooth competence, and behind his eyes he did the kind of calculation that old, powerful beings do when they realize that the ground beneath them has shifted and they are not sure yet how far. He did not like the answer he was starting to arrive at that 47 days into the 60-day window. The Council had produced 3 working groups, 2 subcommittees, 1 emergency resolution about the emergency resolution process, and no decision on the Redistribution Act. This was not accidental. This was the Council operating at its highest skill, the management of time as a weapon, the transformation of urgency into procedure until urgency forgot what it had been angry about. It did not work on humans. It had never worked on humans. The people who built the Council's delay strategy had not fully understood this, and by the time they did, there were 13 days left. Admiral Okafor had not waited for the 60 days to expire to continue moving. The logistics station near Caldwell's Rest was operational, ahead of schedule, because the construction teams had been working in triple shifts and the project director had a personal philosophy about deadlines that bordered on religious commitment. The station could support extended fleet operations across the entire outer reach. It had been designed not just for the current situation, but for the next 50 years of whatever the current situation might become. At day 48, 2 Preth commercial vessels arrived in the outer edge of one of the 6 contested systems, not Caldwell's Rest, but a smaller colony called Harvin's Point, population 400,000, mostly mining families who had been there for 60 years. The vessels filed a resource survey claim with the Council's Colonial Registry, citing the Redistribution Act as their legal basis. It was a test. Everyone understood it was a test. The question was whether the Terran Empire would treat it that way. They did not. A single Terran Imperial frigate arrived at Harvin's Point within 19 hours of the Preth vessel's claim being registered. The frigate did not hail the Preth vessels. It did not warn them. It broadcast, on open channels, a single automated notice. The system was Terran Imperial territory under active military protection, and all non-Terran vessels were required to clear the system within 6 hours or be considered in violation of Imperial space law. The Preth vessels left in 4. The Council received the incident report and convened an emergency session that lasted 3 days and produced a formal protest note. The protest note was delivered to the Terran Embassy on Varith Prime. Sarah Voss received it, signed the acknowledgement of receipt as required by protocol, and filed it. She did not respond to it. There was nothing in the protest note that required a response, and she had long ago learned that responses to things that do not require them give power to things that do not deserve it. But the incident had done something. It had shown the Preth what the Terran Empire was actually going to do when the moment arrived, and the Preth were not a species that tested the same fence twice. Their delegation quietly began drafting a proposal to remove their name from the list of ACT supporters. They needed to do it in a way that didn't look like they were backing down, which was a political problem that Preth politicians were in fact quite good at solving. Within a week, the Preth Collective had introduced a technical amendment to the Act that, if passed, would have the practical effect of exempting established colonies of more than 50 years from redistribution, which covered 5 of the 6 Terran worlds, including Harvin's Point. It was a face-saving maneuver. Sarah recognized it immediately. She sent one message to Morrow: "The Preth are moving. Others will follow. Watch Dravith." Morrow was already watching Dravith. The Varith Elder Counselor had spent the past 6 weeks in a position that was genuinely new to him, behind, rather than ahead, of events. He had built his strategy on assumptions about human behavior that the humans had systematically invalidated, one by one, without appearing to notice they were doing it. He was not a stupid being. He was, in fact, very intelligent, and very intelligent beings sometimes have difficulty with the specific kind of problem that arises when they have been wrong in a way that compounds. Each decision made on the basis of the original wrong assumption had built on the last, and now the structure was tall and unstable and increasingly visible to everyone in the building. He had 2 options left. He could push forward and try to hold the coalition together through the 60-day deadline, hoping that the Terran Empire would find some reason, internal politics, economic pressure, the weight of galactic disapproval, to extend the window and return to negotiation. Or he could find a way to step back from the act that left him with enough political standing to remain effective in his role. On day 53, he made his decision. He called a closed session of the Council's Inner Directorate, the 7 most senior members across species, and said something that had never been said in that room in his memory. "We need to discuss how to end this cleanly." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the Serati representative said, "We have been waiting for this conversation." What followed was 6 hours of the kind of diplomacy that never appears in official records. The working assumption, stated plainly and agreed to without much argument, was that the Redistribution Act needed to be suspended pending a comprehensive review that would take long enough that it would effectively never be implemented. The review would produce a modified framework that protected established colonies, all established colonies, not just Terran ones, because it had to look like principle rather than retreat. The Preth Amendment would be incorporated. The whole thing would be presented as an evolution of Council policy in response to legitimate concerns. The language of retreat dressed in the clothes of progress. The council was very good at this. It was one of the things they were genuinely best at. On day 58, the full council voted on the Preth Amendment. It passed with 23 votes in favor, 4 abstentions, and 4 against. All 4 against being species small enough that their vote had not mattered to the coalition in the first place. Dravith voted in favor. He did not look at Sarah Voss when he cast his vote, and she did not try to catch his eye. Some moments did not need to be acknowledged to be understood. The formal suspension of the Redistribution Act pending full colonial rights review came 2 days later, on day 60, at 9 in the morning Varith Prime local time. Sarah received the official notification, read it twice, and sent one message to Morrow before doing anything else. Done. On Caldwell's rest, Administrator Yusuf Brennan received a notification from the Terran Defense Ministry. The 3 warships in the outer system would remain on station for another 30 days as the situation was formally resolved, and then return to standard patrol rotations. There was no additional commentary. The ministry did not do additional commentary. Yusuf stood at his office window and looked at the red-orange plains and the sky that still sometimes made him catch his breath, and he thought about his grandmother, who had loaded everything she owned onto a colony ship and traveled 400 light years to be here, on this specific piece of ground, under this specific sky. He thought about what she would have done if someone had tried to take it. He thought he probably already knew. He went to work. Across the galaxy, the aftermath settled in the slow way that large things settle. Most of the public narrative in council member worlds framed the act's suspension as a reasonable policy correction, a recognition that the original framework had been too broad and needed refinement. The Terran Empire's pressure was mentioned in passing, usually with language about constructive engagement and productive dialogue. Nobody wrote officially that humanity had looked at the Galactic Council and said no and made it stick. But everyone knew. Kaith, the Yulari analyst, closed out her probability models and filed her final report on the situation. It was the most detailed document she had produced in her career, 300 pages of analysis covering every phase of the Terran response. She spent the most time on something that she considered the most important finding, and the one most likely to be ignored by people who read summaries instead of full documents. The Terran Empire had not done anything that other species could not, in theory, have done. They had applied economic pressure, moved military assets, refused to negotiate on the core issue, and waited. None of these were new tools. The galaxy had seen them before. What was different was something harder to quantify. A particular combination of patience and certainty that did not waver when the council pushed back, did not speed up when time was short, and did not mistake activity for progress. They had known what they wanted, believed they would get it, and acted accordingly from the very beginning. Kaith noted that the historical record of human behavior showed this pattern repeatedly. Not always, not in every situation. Humans were not machines, and their history included failures as dramatic as their successes. But when they had decided that something mattered, truly mattered, they had a way of pursuing it that wore down opposition not through overwhelming force, but through a kind of persistent, organized, calm intention that other species found difficult to counter because it did not give them the right angles to push against. She ended her report with a recommendation. It was simple, and she suspected it would be controversial, and she wrote it anyway, because accurate analysis was worth more than comfortable analysis. The Council, she wrote, should not treat the Terran Empire as a young species that needed management. It should treat them as an established power that had different methods and different values, and was not going to change either. Trying to manage them had created this situation. Not trying to manage them might avoid the next one. She did not know if anyone would listen. She filed the report and went home. On Varith Prime, Elder Counselor Dravith sat alone in his office late on the evening of day 60 and looked at the city lights outside his window. He had been in his role for over 200 years. He had guided the council through 17 major political crises. He had outlasted 6 different Terran Prime directors, 12 fleet admirals, and more ambassadors than he could count. He was patient in the way that very long-lived beings became patient, genuinely, structurally, as a fact of their nature rather than a discipline. He thought about what had happened. Not the politics of it, not the face-saving, not the official narrative, but the actual thing, stripped of all the procedural clothing. The Terran Empire had refused to accept a decision made by the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, had applied pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, had not blinked when he pushed back, and had won. They had won cleanly, without firing a weapon, without breaking a law, without giving the Council anything to point at except their own choice to refuse. He thought about what his advisor had said, months ago, when he had asked what humans did when they decided that talking was finished. She had said they build things. Large things. The station near Caldwell's Rest was still there. The fleet repositioning had not been reversed. The trade review was still ongoing, with no announced timeline for conclusion. The Terran Empire had gotten what it came for, and had not disassembled any of the infrastructure it had built to get here. He was not sure, sitting in his office in the dark, whether that was a warning or simply good strategy. He suspected it was both. And he suspected that the next time a council vote came up that touched Terran interests, every member in that chamber would remember Day 60, and the quiet man with gray temples who had spoken for 40 minutes without notes, and the 3 warships in the outer system of a colony that nobody had tried to take. The galaxy was very old. The council was very old. But humanity was still young by the standards of either, and they had already learned something that the old and powerful sometimes forgot. You did not have to be the biggest thing in the room to be the most dangerous one. You just had to be certain.